with John Yoo, the former Deputy Assistant Attorney General, the UC Berkeley Law Professor, former Thomas law clerk. Tom Dupree, also with us, former Deputy Assistant General. Get his view of this. Tom, ended with you, and the tone and tenor is such that the Trump legal team is saying, this shall not stand. We're ready to appeal. Do they have a case?
Yeah, Neil, look, I mean, I think they're going to have reasonable arguments on appeal. I mean, this is obviously a stunning verdict. It is one that the appellate judges will give very close attention to. I mean, it's a verdict that got national attention. The judge gave 92 pages of findings that the appellate judges will scrutinize very carefully. And so, look, the Trump team lost today. It's not a shock. We kind of knew this is where the judge was going. You'll recall before the trial even began, he already announced he had concluded that former President Trump committed fraud. So today's decision wasn't a surprise. It's obviously a huge number, but again, it's the first battle, and what I suspect will be a long war as this case works its way up through the appellate courts in New York State.
You know, John, my first knee-jerk read when this case was first brought by Letitia James, Attorney General, was there a damaged party? Was there an aggrieved party? Was there a party that was screwed financially, let's say? No, no, and no. Now, I understand that is not the litmus test. But if you're talking numbers like this, shouldn't it be the litmus test?
Neil, I think screwed financially should be part of every first-year law student's dictionary from now on, because this is what really happened here in this decision. This is really interesting. As you put your thumb on it, is one half of this case is, did Donald Trump intend to defraud and lie? And so the judge said that. He said that even before the trial started. The second part of it, the hard part, is the thing that you just mentioned. Who was harmed? And how do you get a figure like $350 million when nobody said they were harmed? That, I think, is a difficult question. Now, the problem for President Trump is going to be, this is because of the way New York State wrote the law. This is because of the way New York's higher courts have interpreted the law. They've already allowed these kinds of lawsuits before where people didn't have to be harmed in order to show harm and damages. The problem is it was never a number this big. And so I think some of the comments you read there, Neil, are correct. That, and we've discussed this on your show before, that if you're going to start imposing hundreds of millions of dollars in penalties and fines on major businesses in New York City, other corporations, other business people, other entrepreneurs and innovators are going to take note, and they're going to see, gosh, what have I said, or what have I ever exaggerated? That means I could be put out of business for 3 years by the Attorney General and by the courts of New York State.
You know, guys, when I look at some of the particulars of this, what stands out is not across the board, but an ignorance about how businesses work and how one, person or entity's valuation of a particular property is obviously at conflict with the one who wants to lowball that property value as much as possible and settle their differences and move on. So when a Deutsche Bank or some of these other banks were involved in sort of chronicling what to them seemed like high valuations, I did find it interesting that the valuation not only of Donald Trump's Trump Tower penthouse, but even the case of Mar-a-Lago with the $1 billion valuation and how they'd exceeded the national norm. Well, New York is a very expensive city. It's way beyond the national norm. Mar-a-Lago, you could argue, with that kind of valuation, there are properties around there going for obscene amounts. It is what it is. It is one of the hottest real estate markets in the world. I only point that out to show, did they kind of reveal maybe their ignorance about business and evaluations and how real estate entities work? In other words, for them to come up with an estimate on their valuations, someone else has to either concur or dispute and do their due diligence, as it appears that Deutsche Bank and some of these other entities, I believe Republic Bank, did, and settled on a middle ground, and business went forward. No one lost money. Tom, what do you think of that?
Well, Neil, I think that you would make a fine appellate lawyer, because I think that actually is maybe the most vulnerable aspect of this opinion, is that the Trump defense team can go to the Court of Appeals and say, look, this trial judge fundamentally misunderstood the nature of a valuation, that he thought valuations are very concise and that people who value property all will do so within a very, very narrow range, when in fact it can actually be different. And you can have two professional valuators look at the same property and come to widely different conclusions. And the fact that they put different numbers on the value of a particular property doesn't necessarily signal that there's a fraud going on. It could just be a difference in professional opinion. And so I think that's going to be a big theme of the Trump team going forward in this case as they try to get this verdict overruled. They're basically going to say that this judge didn't understand the nature of the valuation process. He wasn't familiar with how businesses operate, with how people value property. And for that reason, you just can't sustain this verdict.
You know, John, another thing, too, from Letitia James' office, it claimed that the banks would have charged Donald Trump interest rates several times higher than they ultimately did, had a more accurate accounting of his wealth been provided, and demanded that he pay the state back the difference. And I'm thinking about myself in these kind of stories. When I applied for my first mortgage and follow-up mortgages, my wife and I could say all sorts of things about our financial position. But they're going to check it out, and they're going to check it out mercilessly. So when I claimed that my bocce ball set was worth $10 million, which I didn't, they could say that and say, wait a minute, Cavuto. So in other words, if Donald Trump were making egregious exaggerations, they'd catch that in a near second. I know accountants at brokerage firms at big banks. They're the most ruthless people on the planet, and I mean that in a good way, but they know how to check someone's BS. And they checked it. They did business with him. They probably renegotiated some aspects of some of these deals and merrily went on. But they didn't lose anything as a result. And I know, as you both pointed out, that is a different matter when it comes to these type of issues. But on appeal, is it a credible matter? What do you think, John?
Neil, you are far more scrupulous about your mortgage applications than I was, but luckily I paid mine off years ago.
I was just shocked they said yes, John. I was shocked they said yes. That's it. That was a long time ago.
But let's not look at our credit card applications now. That would be truly dangerous.
There we go.
So look, this is. I think you got a great point. And it plays to and against Trump, because that's the basic question: is why should this trial judge or even the appeals courts substitute their judgment for what is financially reasonable or not, rather than these very sophisticated counterparties like Deutsche Bank, like other investment banks? They're not in it to lose money. They're dealing with billions of dollars in loans and assets. You think they will be very careful. In fact, you think they'd be more careful with that than they would be reviewing your mortgage application or my mortgage application. But on the other hand, I think this hurts Trump in the sense when regular people hear about the amount of damages, they're going to be shocked. But when you explain it the way you just did, Neil, why can Donald Trump lie on his mortgage applications, essentially, and say that he has assets which are 400% or whatever more than their real value? Why should he be able to get away with that when, Neil, you and I, if we ever did that in our applications, we would never get a mortgage and we'd be in big trouble?
Well, they did say no in the bocce ball thing, but that's a separate story. One of the things, guys, that Letitia James brought up, apparently, if this is right, she originally sought $250 million in penalties, but ratcheted up to the $370 million she was seeking. She got darn close to that, just by a few million. She alleged constituted all the ill-gotten financial gains that filtered down from these financial deceptions. But again and again, what comes up here, guys, is and this is coming from Judge Erdogan himself, ticked off that Donald Trump was evasive or argumentative. So if he had not been as argumentative, if he had not been doing these sessions with the press right outside that courtroom, is the judge intimating, is Letitia James intimating that they would have gone lighter on him? Because that's a little weird.
Yeah, and Neil, that to me was one of the more interesting aspects of this opinion today, is that you don't have to read between the lines that closely to see that the judge was expressing a lot of really personal frustration and resentment of Donald Trump. And from my perspective, at least, I think that does make his decision maybe a little more vulnerable on appeal than it would otherwise have been. In other words, you have to say, was this judge able to kind of put aside the frustration that he felt? And in many cases, it's understandable. I mean, there's no question that the former president was a handful in the courtroom, to say the least. But a judge has to be able to put all of that aside and decide a case based on the facts and the law. And so the fact that you do have this theme woven throughout his opinion, I think is going to cause the appellate court to maybe raise a suspicious judicial eyebrow.
So, guys, help me out with the math here. You're also good at that, but that's more my turf than the legal stuff. So I'm looking at the $83.3 million judgment stemming from the defamation lawsuit regarding E. Jean Carroll. I'm looking at this $350 million plus penalty. And how much does he have to put up for both while he pursues appeals or second chances in court? John, I'll go to you first on that.
I'm not an expert on this, but I think that he has to post a bond to appeal that's roughly the same amount of the decision. So I think he, put the E. Jean Carroll case, which we talked about, this case, I think he has to post a bond for $300 million. Now, after this decision, who's going to loan him the money to challenge a decision that says he lies when he borrows money? And if you loan him money,
and by the way, he can't apply for any loans for up to 3 years. And the collateral that he would likely use for these loans is the very real estate that they said you better not touch, quote, use, or do anything with. So he's kind of like penniless in that situation, that the money he presumably could tap or collateralize, he can't, right?
Yeah, he'd have to look for personal assets, maybe something in Florida. Maybe he could borrow it from a Florida bank. I find $300 million in liquid assets. I think even Donald Trump would have trouble raising this. But here's what I put to you, Neil, and this is I think you raised it with your previous question, was Donald Trump pursued a very hostile strategy with the judge. The judge had already said he was going to lose, and this was just about how much it was going to cost. I think Donald Trump made a calculated decision. Okay, I'm going to lose anyway. Maybe it'll be $300 million, but I'm going to dominate the primary airwaves. And so Donald Trump, you could ask him, and it's sort of like what we're asking with E. Jean Carroll. Is it worth $20 million every time you insult E. Jean Carroll? You could say, Donald Trump, was it worth $300 million to win the Republican primary by dominating the media, by going to the courtrooms, by turning it into a circus? You knew you were going to lose. You knew by doing that you're going to lose the maximum. But now you're stuck, because how is he going to be able to appeal? How is he going to be able to raise the money, post the appeal bond, in order to get up to the appeals court?
Yeah, it is weird. Now, he could, to your point, gentlemen, he could seek to secure bonds during the appeals process. But again, much of that would be based on the very properties in question they're claiming that he inflated in the first place. So I imagine are untouchable, but I could be wrong. There is this other possibility. I don't know what you think, Tom, of him saying, the hell with it, I'm moving to Florida. Jeff Bezos did, Elon Musk did, or not, I think Elon Musk just went to Texas. But my point being that they're saving a heck of a lot of money. There the focus was on state taxes. But the fact of the matter is, can he do something like that? Can he say, everything I have in New York, guess what? Now I'm headquartered in Florida. What happens then? Or is it after the fact he can't do that now?
Well, I mean, he certainly can still move to Florida. I mean, in fact, if he's prohibited from doing business in New York, assuming that sanction stays in place, it might make sense for him to move to Florida and run his business there. That's, of course, assuming that he doesn't get reelected president. And I can't imagine that the organization didn't have a contingency plan in place for something like this to happen. It was fairly clear the judge was signaling where he was going with this case. So I can't imagine it came as a surprise to Trump that he is barred from doing business in New York. I suspect he's immediately going to run to the appeals court and ask them to stay that prohibition to allow him to continue doing business in New York while this case is on appeal. But if that effort fails, you've got to imagine, Neil, that they have some sort of contingency plan in place to allow these businesses to continue to operate, again, from outside the confines of New York.
You mentioned now going to the New York Court of Appeals. John, I noticed on our Shannon Bream is reporting that all 7 of the judges on the New York Court of Appeals, that's the highest state court, that they are appointed by governors to 14-year terms, And all the current judges in this court were appointed by Governor Cuomo or Governor Hochul. Last time I checked, both Democrats. So I don't want to imply that that will make it an uphill battle for Donald Trump, but I wonder, what do you think?
I think the precedents, the existing case law is already against Trump, and I think it's going to be hard for this appeals court to reverse those precedents and say, no, we're going to change the existing law in order to benefit Donald Trump, who this trial judge, and this is an important distinction between what appellate courts do and what trial judges do. Appellate courts are only there to settle questions of legal interpretation. The trial judge, Judge Engelrath, is there to find the facts. This is really a case mostly about the facts, like how much money is at stake, which properties, and important questions like, did Donald Trump lie? You'll notice in the opinion that the judge goes through every witness, every defendant, and gives his evaluation of what they were like on the stand, whether he thought they were credible, which is to what really, for the non-lawyers out there, is whether he was lying or not. And this judge is very careful to make it as factual as possible so that an appeals court, when it looks at the decision, it's not going to find a lot to overturn. The only real question is the one you started with, Neil, I think that appeals court will look at, which is, can you impose a $350 million judgment in a fraud case where no counterparty, no one on the other side of the deal said they were harmed or raised an objection? That's more of a legal claim. But all these other findings, that Donald Trump was lying, that he intentionally committed fraud, that it cost $350 million, those are usually the kind of things that an appeals court doesn't want to touch.
All right, gentlemen, I want to thank you both very much.
Hey, Sean Hannity here. Hey, click here to subscribe to Fox News YouTube page and catch our hottest interviews and most compelling analysis. You will not get it anywhere else.